Introduce Sebastian Pokutta.
Yeah.
So Sebastian has been hopping the pond quite a bit. I guess that really refers to more of a UK reference, but he's been going between Germany and the US, between study and work, focusing on thinking, but also with industrial engineering. So he's a faculty member in industrial engineering here at Georgia Tech. He's worked at MIT and has a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. You all received his paper through the email, and if not, you'll be able to read that afterwards. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot for the very nice introduction. Yeah, so what I would like to talk about today is a study that I conducted with a colleague of mine approximately 2 or 3 years ago. And the core of the study is to understand or to try to leverage knowledge about how people feel about certain activities that they are conducting in the course of the day in terms of deriving or obtaining, say, schedules or day plans that improve or increase happiness. And yeah, so that's what I would like to talk about today. So the reason why I'm here today is because our work also has been recently quite prominent in the news. Unfortunately, the way of how things were cited, they were not necessarily always the most accurate ones. And I'm going to clear up some of these misunderstandings later. So what I'm mostly going to talk about today is the term that is called quality of life. So when I talk about quality of life, I'm not referring to the colloquial term that you might be thinking of, but I'm rather talking about the psychological measure of quality of life. And quality of life is at the core of policy making, either in an explicit way or an implicit way, because you want your citizens to feel happy and feel good about being in a country, because they otherwise try to leave and go to a different country, or you have to put pretty drastic measures in place in order to keep people in their country and be productive. Also, the reason, so it is a policy goal to improve or maintain quality of life. On the other hand, what has been observed in the last years is that if you look at the correlation between GDP growth or GDP and quality of life, then the correlation that we have seen over the last couple of decades significantly weakened. So it's not true in developed societies anymore that you push GDP growth further, that people become more happy, more confident with their lives. And that is one of the big assumptions of economic prosperity, that if you prosper more, then people are happier, enjoy more living in the country. So this weakened correlation between GDP growth and what people call subjective well-being is the reason why people started to more and more look into managing and optimizing subjective well-being. So quality of life as a measure is also very different from what people call standard of living. Standard of living is mainly income-driven measure, versus quality of life includes wealth, but also employment, physical, mental health, leisure activities, a feeling of social belonging, and many, many more, say, of soft factors that contribute to you feeling good about yourself and being happy living in a certain country. So, as you can imagine, given that quality of life is at the core of policy making, or is supposed to be at the core of policy making, it's imperative to manage quality of life to maintain economic sustainability and prosperity. However, apart from the decline of correlation between GDP growth and subjective well-being, what we also have seen is that significant changes in culture, due to the fact that, for example, people have access to things like Facebook, social networks, and so on and so forth. But due to these factors, there also has been a change in what people believe contributes to their happiness. For example, people spend quite a bit of time on the internet and social networks, and they actually enjoy this activity, although this is an activity that we would not classically understand as something that necessarily makes you happy. So there's quite a big movement in terms of understanding these changes in culture, as well as this decoupling of GDP growth and subjective well-being, in order to understand how we can manage and improve quality of life. So having said that, as you can imagine, quality of life is a pretty elusive measure, and in fact quality of life, or also subjective well-being, where subjective well-being refers to the individual person. Quality of life is a more broader term for society. It's very hard to quantify. The reason for this is that everybody has their own preferences, everybody has their own, say, saturation levels. Just because some person likes to watch 8 hours TV a day doesn't mean that everybody else enjoys it to the same extent. So it's very hard to quantify these things. So up to today, there are effectively two methods in place to manage or to measure quality of life or subjective well-being. The first one is the so-called experience sampling method, and the second one is the day reconstruction method. I'm going to talk about those later anyway, so I'm just going to glance over them. However, the core observation here is that although there are a lot of studies looking at DRM and DSM, it turns out that what people measure and how they measure is very, very different, so that in the end you have 10 studies and it's very hard to compare the results in terms of, do they say the same thing, do they indicate something completely opposite, and that makes it very hard to really get any information from these work beyond the point of describing reality and actually prescribing something in order to improve subjective well-being. Moreover, most of the studies, and our study is subject to the same limitation given the data set that we use, they do not incorporate long-term perspectives in planning. So typically, if you think about it, there are a lot of things that you do nowadays that you might not enjoy because you hope that in the future you will gain something from this. You get utility later in the future. However, the way of how we measure quality of life and subjective well-being right now is a pretty myopic measure. So you only look at what's giving me the biggest bang for the buck if I do this activity today. But we don't care for the consequences in the future. So classical studies do not really account a lot for this. And the last thing that is very critical for measuring quality of life and turning it into a prescriptive framework is that you have to somehow account for saturation and marginal decrease of utility. And the reason is very simple. Just because you like to eat, say, 1 bar of chocolate doesn't mean that you enjoy it as much if you eat 10, 100, and so on. So there's a natural saturation here, and the marginal utility that you derive from an extra piece of chocolate is going to decrease over time. And this is something that has led to quite a headache because that effectively prevents you to make policy prescriptions because you don't really understand when you reach saturation points of people's activities. And just to summarize this with two very famous quotes. One is Robert Constanza, who said that while quality of life has been long at the core of policymaking, adequate definitions and measures remain elusive. On the other hand, we have the famous quote by Peter Drucker that said that what's measured improved. So he was a proponent of introducing all kinds of measures to actually understand processes and be able to improve. Okay, so having said that, if you see what I've talked about so far, you might be wondering, this is a very elusive measure that I'm talking about. It's very intangible, and why would you be interested in at all to try to formalize this or quantify this, where you have very hard time, say, quantifying the positive effects from it. So there's some very interesting case, and that's the case of Bhutan. So Bhutan is a kingdom that is located in the South Asia, and it's at the eastern end of the Himalayas, and it's a very small country, roughly 3/4 of a million of inhabitants. It's very small in terms of area. It's just about 40,000 square kilometers. And the Human Development Index is medium, so it's 0.5. And only in 1999, TV and internet were more or less introduced to the public, because up to that point it was subject to a government ban. So if I see these statistics and you just take the numbers, you would not necessarily think of Bhutan as being a especially happy country where you would enjoy living in. However, reality is completely different. What Bhutan does is Bhutan measures a gross national happiness product, if you want, so they don't measure GDP, but GNH. And their whole policy making is set to improve GNH, nothing else. So their only policy is make people more happy. So, and now you might wonder, does this lead to anything positive? And the answer is yes. So in 2006, there was a huge survey that was conducted by Business Week to understand how people feel about living in certain countries. And it turned out that Bhutan is the happiest country in Asia and the 8th happiest country worldwide. Okay? So if you compare these things, if you look at only these numbers here, you see small country, small population. Human development is somewhere in the medium, so Not particularly something where you would say, I would be very happy to live there. However, just because everything is focused on measuring subjective well-being, it turns out that people are actually very, very happy to live in Bhutan. And that is the business case for actually managing subjective well-being in quality of life. So having said that, let me talk a bit about the data reconstruction method, which is at the basis of how data, the data that we use has been collected. And the idea is very simple. People get a questionnaire, and this questionnaire contains a couple of questions regarding what the people did the day beforehand. It asks how much time did you spend on watching TV, how much time did you spend socializing with your friends, how much time did you spend with your husband or wife, and so on and so forth. And for each of these activities you denote how you felt about the activity. So there's a certain scale from 0 to 6. You say, okay, I felt happy, I felt anxious, it was stressful, and so on and so forth. And based on this, you compute something like an emotional profile of the people. That's the idea behind the data reconstruction method. As you can imagine, this is a self-reported measure, so it's subject to bias, like every self-reported measure. And that's why it's often used in conjunction with other measures to smoothen out the effects from the biases. A big advantage and also disadvantage at the same time is that the recollection of the event is delayed. And you will see this in comparison to the ESM. So it means that you talk about what you experienced only the day afterwards. It has the big advantage that it somewhat smoothens out the emotions. If you recollect something from the day beforehand, you might be less stressed about it, you might be less anxious. So it gives a slightly more leveled out and smoothened out profile about the emotions. On the other hand, I mean, it could also be that you overstate certain things and understate others, so there's again a bias issue. How does it compare to ESM? So ESM has up to the point where we introduced the data reconstruction method, or where it was introduced by Kahneman et al. And we used their data. ESM had been the standard method at this point. And the idea of ESM, it's the experience sampling method, is that you ping people certain amount of times a day at random and ask them, what are you doing, how are you feeling, how long have you been doing this, and so on and so forth. And based from this, you try to derive how people spend the day, how they're feeling, and so on and so forth. So by the way of how it's designed, ESM is an unbiased measure, which is good for like statistical purposes. You can argue everything has been completely unbiased, everything is fine. But this is good and bad at the same time for our purposes. So first of all, the reason why it's bad is that when you ping people a certain amount of times a day, you might not ping the high importance event that made people feel happy about the day, or that made people feel bad about the day, because you would say, I don't know, I say roughly once an hour. So everything that is a bit shorter than that, you might not really find. That's why you get a very skewed image, so picture. So everything that has short time duration, but contributes a lot to your happiness, or not happiness, like sadness, say, is not really reflected here. That's why the ESM method has certain limitations. On the other hand, you can increase the sampling frequency, but the more you ping people, the more you influence actually the measure. If you have to answer every 30 seconds how you're feeling, what you're doing, and how long you've been doing this, that's not going to be an enjoyable day anyways. So yeah, so there's a certain problem here. Another thing, what people argue why that ERM is way superior to ESM is that we care for subjective well-being, so how people feel about their things. So why don't you take what they report? Why do you try to get an unbiased measure? You want the biased measure because you care for what the people were thinking, not what you derive what they were supposed to feel or how they are supposed to be behaving. So having this bias in there is actually something that people appreciate because you care for subjective well-being and not some objective interference of how people are supposed to feel. So that's also why our study is based on data that comes from the data reconstruction method. Okay, so having said that, what are challenges in this context? Well, the challenges are more or less what we have seen beforehand. So this field of happiness psychology is pretty well developed. People have a very good understanding of the effects that are happening, also like correlation between tiredness and how we feel about certain activities. There's this V phenomenon that people are very happy about having discovered. However, the main issue is that just because you can measure something and you can detect how people feel about what they're doing at a specific point in time, it does not tell you how you can use this information now to generate something that tells people if you would have done this different than that, you would have been a happier person. So it's not clear how you go from the descriptive setup to the prescriptive setup. And that was one of the biggest criticism in the whole field of happiness research, that people did not really know how to take what they measured in order to prescribe something to get a better overall happiness, so to improve the day by changing activities. And the main reason for this is that people did not really know how to deal with the decreasing marginal utility of certain activities. Just because you like ice cream, you don't want to eat ice cream all day long, although you love it. And that was one of the core problems. And that's exactly where we started out. So what we wanted to do, and it's really more in terms of the thought experiments, we wanted to go from a descriptive framework to a prescriptive framework. So we measure something, but we don't just want to measure it, but we would also like to derive some insight from it, how you could improve your subjective well-being by changing certain activities in the course of the day. And how did we do this, or what did we try to do, is we combined pretty standard tools. So we used the day reconstruction method from psychology. We used very simple utility functions from economics, so there's nothing fancy going on. And we used very, very basic, really basic optimization stuff from operations research to be able to put everything together in a framework where, given what you have observed in terms of people's say, subjective well-being on a given day, given certain activities, how you can compute a schedule that is giving them the most utility in terms of happiness for that particular day. Okay, so what do we do not do? So I'd like to talk about some limitations first, because I switched to the actual model. So first of all, one thing that I already mentioned earlier is that people typically maximize their utility over the course of days, weeks, years, and so on and so forth. So you have long-term planning. The reason why you go to school is because you want to get a good job. If you only would look at one day, there would be no reason to go to school. Next thing, it's really important to understand the way of how we designed our model. It really has to be understood as a thought experiment. We do not have any constraint that makes sure that you can survive a long time on that schedule. For example, work will be very underrepresented, but if you do not work, at some point you run out of money, and then you have a problem. So all these effects are not accounted for here, because we really wanted to just understand the effects coming from utility and marginal decrease of utility, but not making it specifically realistic for the course of like living by that schedule. Yeah, so also we could introduce additional constraints to the framework. That's perfectly fine. However, we didn't do this because we really wanted to isolate the effect. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, and this is a problem of all these studies, there are very few long-term dimensions really reflected in here. And the problem is not that people are not aware that the long-term dimensions of happiness are very important. It's just, it's so hard to measure. You have to follow people over years before you have a data set that is usable for something. And then on top of it, it turns out very often, because it's, you have to control for so many biases, that it's very, very hard to get accurate and correct data. Because in fact, what you would have to do is you don't have to just observe people in reality, but you also have to take a happy person, put them in a bad environment, and see whether their overall happiness changes to get a really realistic data set. And that's really hard to do in reality. Another thing that is important to mention is, so our data set that we had was a US-based data set. So the first one is actually from Texas. The second one is from the whole of the US. And of course, there are huge cultural differences that one needs to control for. And so it's desirable to do the same for like data from other countries. However, unfortunately, there are not that many data sets available, so it's very hard to do this comparison at this point. All right. So yeah. So having said that, so for example, yeah. So we do not claim what's the ideal day is how you should spend your life, and it's not necessarily realistic for everyday use. Okay. So having said that, let's get a bit to the data sets and look at what there we had for the study. So we used the first data set that we used is the very famous data set by Daniel Kahneman et al., which was at the basis of the development of the day reconstruction method. This data set is considered seminal because it was the first one that has been collected. And also a lot of follow-up work is actually using the same data set, and this is why we use the data set to be able to somewhat try to compare our results to results that have been obtained before. But as a disclaimer, this data set is not necessarily the most representative one, and there are larger ones that we also took, but they come with different problems. So what was the characteristic of the data set? The data set that Kahneman et al. Generated surveyed about 900 employed women, roughly 50% white, 24% African American, 22% Hispanic, 5% others. Mean age was about 38 years, mean household income roughly 50K, and the location was Texas. So these people have been selected by an unbiased procedure. They got these survey documentation, and they were observed over a certain amount of time, and the data had been collected. So what is then done after you have all these reports about subjective well-being of this respective people? What you do is you look for when people reported positive effect. Positive effect is everything that made you happy, like happy. You reported warm or friendly feelings. You reported that you enjoyed yourself. All this is considered positive effect, and you just average them out. And then you have negative effect, that is everything that does not make you happy. So when you're frustrated, annoyed, depressed, hesitant, pushed around, and so on and so forth. So just average them together. This gives you an idea of positive and negative effect of people. And what we care for in our study is even a slightly more reduced measure. We only look for the net effect. So this is effectively the amount of happiness that you generated after you subtracted everything that you felt bad about. And that's the measure that we use for our analysis. So how does such a data set look like? So here's a summary of the data set. You have a set of activities here: intimate relations, socializing, relaxing, eating, exercising, watching TV, shopping, preparing food, and so on and so forth. These are the categories that have been suggested, where people reported how much time they spend on the respective activities. They are constructed in such a way that they are mutually exclusive, hopefully, but completely exhaustive. Then people reported their corresponding positive effects, negative effects. There were a couple of other measures that they controlled for that are not important for us here. And then they reported how much time they spent a day doing these activities. The same thing was done for interaction partners, such as friends, relatives, spouses, and significant others, children, customers, clients, and so on and so forth. And again, the positive effect and the negative effect was reported, some other measures, and how much time they spent doing these activities a day. So you had a pretty good idea how they felt about something that they were doing and how much time they spent a day doing that particular activity. Okay, so that's the first data set that we have been using. Then the second data set that we used is the one from the so-called American Time Use Survey. It's a huge data set that is collected by the Census Bureau. They collect it, process it by phone interviews. It's more representative, it's way larger, it's independent of gender, it's the whole of the US. They collect a large amount of auxiliary data, which is very helpful to control for certain effects. They also split them up in employed and unemployed, which changes things quite significantly in some directions, not so much in other directions. However, the reason why we have to be a bit careful with this data set is that the way of how it is collected had a software error. So the way of how they collected the data is erroneous because they underrepresent activities that you do at the end of the day, just by the way of how they conducted the interviews. So there's huge bias in the data, and we have to be very careful with this data set. Moreover, they report slightly different variables. They only report how happy, without a distinction by emotions you felt about doing certain activities. But there's no differentiation what happy means for you, versus the other one differentiates by type of emotion. Nonetheless, just on a very broad level, the results that you obtain for both data sets are very comparable, so there's not a lot happening there. Okay, so how does this data set look like? It's very similar in terms of activities. You have, again, personal care, eating, work, job search, shopping, many, many others. Here, as I said, differentiated between employed and unemployed. However, which is problematic, you do not have reported times of how much time people invested a day doing these activities. Which is bad because it does not really allow you in the end to compare how did they spend the day and how were they supposed to spend the day. And that's why this is a slightly unfortunate data set. Also, you can see there are very interesting differences here. For example, if you look at, say, services, personal care, and household, that includes everything that someone is doing for somebody else. Then you see that the employed people reported rather high happiness for this versus the unemployed people reported only a measure of 1. So 1 was the baseline here. So it's slightly different than the other one. It started with 1. So yeah, so there are a couple of interesting findings if you look at the data.
And what's the upper bound? Is it 5?
It's here it's 1 and 7, I think, and the other one is 0 and 6. I think this is 1 and 7, yes. So they are very comparable. So this data set was started to be collected after Kahneman's data set, and the methodology has been modeled after that, however, with certain shortcomings because they do not report times and so on and so forth. Yeah, so what do we borrow now from economics to get a hold of the marginal decrease of utility? It's a very simple concept. We use really utility functions. And the idea of a utility function is something very simple. The utility function allows you to account for a decrease of how much happiness you derive from a certain activity if you do it longer. And the one that we used is the log utility function because it's believed to capture human utility quite well. It's also the oldest one. It goes back to Bernoulli and Petersburg paradox. And just for control, we also computed schedules with respect to other utility functions just to see how the effects change when you change the utility function. The only thing that you need to really remember about utility functions is probably that the longer you do something, the less you derive in terms of happiness or feeling from those functions. Another big advantage is if one wants, one can actually calibrate these utility functions for specific persons. There's a so-called bootstrapping method that allows to, by a certain way of how you measure, like you do it by an interview and by how you measure certain responses from questions, you can pretty accurately bootstrap the utility function of a specific person. So that's why we took this utility function-based approach. And then the optimization model that we use is an extremely simple optimization model. There's really not a lot of optimization in the classical sense going on. So what we do is we have certain activities I. Each of the activity gives you a net effect, so how much happiness you can derive from it. And now we allocate time for this activity I subject to the utility that we derive from spending time in it there. So it's a very, very simple optimization model. It has no other constraints. It was just like maximize this function. The only constraint is that you, of course, can only spend 1 day. So we work with 16 waking hours, which is the standard assumption, which corresponds to 960 minutes. And yeah, so this model is very simple. It has a closed form solution. You can just derive it by hand. It's very nice because it allows you to isolate really effects from the decrease in utility. And also, there's a certain, how should I say, philosophical reason to take a simple model. Because the less you know, the more robust your model should be. So I'm always a friend of taking parsimonious models or the most parsimonious model. And that's definitely as simple as it gets for this type of problems. Another thing that we also did, we also looked at the interaction partners. It's exactly the same thing, except for you not taking the activities here, but you look at the utility and the net effect that you derive from interaction partners. Alright, so let's look at the findings. So if you apply this optimization method and you solve the corresponding problem, what you end up with is a happiness scale that looks roughly like this. So depending on the effect that you derive, the net effect that you derive from an activity, a certain amount of time is allocated for the activity, and you see that intimate relations with the highest net effect gets the most time. However, also the activities that got very little net effect, like working, commuting, still get a sizable chunk of time. Right? So you would imagine that if I can take my perfect day, everything that I don't like, I don't do at all, first thing. And then everything that I like, I would somehow distribute, but I would definitely make sure that what I like most, I would spend most of the time with. But it turns out from an economic or utility point of view, this is not necessarily what you want to do. So even if you have an activity that gives you a low net effect, it makes still sense to invest some time in it because it still gives you some positive feeling about it. Just think of it like in terms of diversity. Right? I mean, if you always do the same thing, you get bored. So just doing something that, I mean, even if mowing the lawn is not a nice thing to do, if you do it once a year, it's maybe not too bad because it's a nice change of the daily routine.
So do we interpret this as for the ideal time for working is 36 minutes? Is that what it's saying?
Yes.
For an individual?
Yes. So we have to be very careful about the interpretation because it's really just a thought experiment.
Right.
So this is what comes out of this is two things. So first of all, this schedule is for the average person. So we took the average effect of average over all people, and that's a schedule. Of course, different people feel different about certain activities, but you could compute the same schedule person specifically. But because we did not get access to this person-specific data, we took the average one. That's point number one. Point number two, yes, it's true, this schedule would suggest that you only work 36 minutes a day. The problem with this, of course, is that it's not necessarily very sustainable, and after a couple of months, you would be unemployed, and then I'm pretty sure that your happiness would drop quite sharply from there on. And yeah, so this really has to be understood more like if you do not have any outside constraints, and if you do not have consequences of your action that you do today, tomorrow, then this would be the allocation that would give you the most utility, provided that your effect for certain activities is close to what the average effect was that I showed you before. So that's the correct assumptions. So so just like a brief summary before we look at the table. So in conclusion, what you get from these models is you get very balanced day schedules. So even for activities that you do not necessarily think of being very nice, they will be still included with a certain amount of time. And if you think back, the first activity had 106 minutes, the last activity had 33 minutes. It's about a rough factor of 3.5 to 4 in terms of how much time you spend in certain activities. The second one, my second point here is something that you would expect. If something feels nicer to you, you would spend more time on it. If something does not feel nice to you, you would spend less time on it. Also, some activities would remain constant. What is maybe interesting to see, or that was interesting for us, is to see the grave deviation between how you actually spend your time a day and what this schedule looks like. Even though this might not be a realistic schedule in terms of what you can implement in a given day, it's very interesting to see the deviation. So work, for example, is something that we spend the most time on, as we will see in a second. However, it's the one that gives us the least positive effect. And other things that we spend that gives us a lot of positive effect, or net effect even, like intimate relations, we spend typically very little time on, versus this exactly suggests the other way around. So yeah, so having said that, what is desirable, as I have already mentioned earlier, is at some point to make this person specific, but for this two things have to be in place. First of all, you need to have person-specific utility functions. You have to bootstrap them, which is very costly. Moreover, as I mentioned before, it's not clear how you really would want to do this in a setup of the day, because you cannot meet the person 1,000 times a day and ask them what they're doing and how they feel, because that's definitely affecting how they feel. So that's a huge issue, and we have very little way of getting around this. So there's some discussion going on whether all these nice gimmicks and tools that we have that measure your heart rate, your sugar level, and so on and so forth, if we can use data from this to get at least from the physical reactions an idea of how people have been feeling in the course of the day. But that's more or less for future research, let's say. So far the methods don't really work well. Okay, so let's maybe quickly look at the tables, just to give you an idea. So again, you have the activities from the K-limit index on the left-hand side. You see the net effect for certain activities, and then you see the time distribution in percent of the utility function that we have been using here. That was the log utility function. And here on this side you have the actual time that was invested. The other three are just other utility functions just for control purposes. And what you can see is, for example, we spend 25% of our time at work. It's the activity after commuting that gives us the least net effect, versus in an optimal schedule, again, without any consequences for the future, you would only spend about 4% of the time on this specific day. Yes?
So, I mean, you've suggested that utility varies with how long you spend on a particular activity. And I would note that the one that you're rating highest slope of we expect an additional amount to actually give us more pleasure, there's a kind of bias built into that. We actually
Yes.
don't have people randomized across these different
Yes.
activities, so we don't actually know in a randomized schedule how much utility they would get from a particular activity.
Yes, that's exactly one of the big problems, right? Because you could argue the one that has the highest net effect here is also the one that we spend the least time on, and that is the reason, just by utility theoretic considerations, that the effect of this is the highest because you invested the lowest time. And similarly here, the one that where you spend the most time on is also the highest. So this is something that is really in the data. That is a bias, and it's not clear how you can remove the bias, because for this you would really have to take people and take someone that does not want to work and felt happy and force them to work 8 hours and see if they get less happy, let's say, and do it the other way around. And that's very hard to do. So this is a bias that is there, and we're actually thinking of how we can get around this bias and get it out of the data, but it's not completely clear. Yeah, so this is for the activities here. We did the same things for the interaction partners. What was interesting in the data, and that also led to quite some follow-up and conclusion, is that spending time with friends, and almost all studies, also those that have been conducted afterwards, indicate that this gives us the highest level of happiness. And even before spending time with relatives, spouses, children, work, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting because it's quite significant. The others are very close together here, but this one is significantly higher. And that, of course, then in our schedules leads to the fact that you spend quite a bit of time on these activities, and in particular you spend most of the time with friends. But as you see, this is way more balanced here than, for example, here. So here the total deviation is less than a factor of 2, versus where here the total deviation is between 3.5 from the lowest activity to 3.7. Yeah, so and especially if you compare this to how we spend time. So as I said, for work it's probably one of the most prominent ones, with 25% that we spend. And we are supposed to spend roughly 4%, and vice versa for intimate relations. This is a bit different for the interaction partners. Here, the time that we invest actually somewhat well matches the time of how we were supposed to distribute time. So you can see this here, you have like 17% versus 10. Yes, it's still quite a difference, but it's way less than 3% or 4% versus 25%. And also here, this is like 14% versus 9%, 14 versus 11. So they're very close together. So in terms of how we spend time with our interaction partners, that very much matches how we are supposed to spend our time according to these schedules. Whereas when it comes to the activities, it's actually quite a bit off. Okay, so yeah, and we did a similar computation for the AQS study, and what you find in the end, if you really compare the data and try to match them to the corresponding categories, you will see that they are actually very comparable. That's like, so what is interesting is like everything that had a huge shift beforehand in reported happiness, such as services, also leads them to a corresponding huge shift in terms of how the optimal schedule would allocate time. So one thing, for example, is interesting if you look, I think at work, this column, you see that the unemployed rate work significantly higher in terms of effect than the employed ones. Which, when we get back to the utility question from before, which indicates the more time you spend on it, the less happy you feel about it, and vice versa. Of course, if I'm not working, I might actually enjoy the idea of going to work again, versus once you're at work, you wish that you did not go back in the first place. Yeah, so, I think that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Did you analyze the two data sets separately, or it was like the one chart with the shades of blue for the average utility? Is that all of the data like aggregated from each of the two studies, or?
No, this was separately. So
you analyzed the Kahneman data separate from
Yes,
the ATUS data. Okay.
Yes, the reason for this is really that for the AQS data to really control for the results, we would have needed the times that people spend on the activities, and they just don't collect this data.
You don't
So,
have, okay.
yeah, and then it's very dangerous to make good statements about it, in particular given that there are errors in the data anyways.
So it looks like the Kahneman was all females.
Yes.
And did they differentiate between anything besides employed and unemployed?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. So they actually report quite a bit of auxiliary data. The problem is, so we averaged out here in this one. The only thing that we looked for was employed and unemployed, because that was a certain research question associated with this question. That's why we differentiated between employed and unemployed. But here it's completely mixed. It's completely gender unspecific, and it's 50-50.
So when I look at the results from the two data sets, it seems that they're very similar, and I would hypothesize that the gendered, the female data would show different results for cooking, children, a host of other things, versus the balanced gender data set. I'm wondering how you interpreted that.
Yeah, so they look pretty similar, I think, right? In terms of how, I mean, the main issue with the AQS data is we don't really know how much time people spend on it. So we would like to know how much utility they derived and how much they spent, because otherwise it's very hard to compare. But it seems from at least the reported levels of happiness that they are very similar. So there seems to be, in terms of enjoying certain activities, there seems to be no difference between genders. Yes.
So I'm not very familiar with how the gross national happiness index is calculated. But in terms of wanting to make decisions with multiple indicators, and I think Bhutan is doing it. Maybe there are other countries that are doing it. How realistic is it to try to use such a measure the same way GDP has been used in conjunction with other measures? GDP, environmental capital, natural environment capital, etc. If you're thinking in the context of sustainable development, and you really want to evaluate it rather than just simply have it be a hand-waving kind of activity.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think there's very little doubt at this point that happiness or subjective well-being needs to go into these considerations one way or another, because we see this huge drop in correlation between GDP level, GDP growth, and happiness. And that's an issue. That really becomes an issue, because people have more money. Every economic theory tells them, oh, they should be well off, they should have a lot of fun, they should be happy people, and it turns out that they're not happy. So there's a huge break in correlation there. People are really afraid of this. So this is why this whole field came back to life. So the main issue remains that it's very hard to quantify, but it's also, even if you quantify it, how much weight in your policy making do you actually put on increasing happiness? Bhutan is a very special case. So there, everything is one directionally optimized into the direction of you making you a happy person. But Bhutan has other shortcomings, because economic measures don't matter at all, for example. So I think I think you can, in a reasonable way, implement something like subjective well-being management into policymaking. However, it has to be well balanced off against long-term measures like sustainability, economic growth indicators, employment, unemployment rates, and so on and so forth. So it's not completely clear how you can do it, but I'm pretty certain that in the future that you have to include it one way or another.
You mentioned limitations in data collection and highlighted some technologies that are being used now, sensors and things like that to measure heart rate and so on. I'm wondering if there are other, like social media, that that you and your partner have considered using in data collection that might optimize those
Yes, so there is actually yes. So the answer is yes, there's a lot going on, and people have been doing this very excessively for London. So there's a project, it's called Mappiness, and what you do is you try to understand where in the city people feel happy and where they don't feel happy. So just by the GPS in their cell phones, they have smartphone applications. They just ping them once a day and ask, hey, where are you right now? I mean, they know where they are from the GPS signal. How do you feel about the day? And they just have a couple of buttons and just click on it. And they have a very detailed map about London, how people feel in London at given points in time of day. So for example, you can see when the commuters come in that the happiness drops quite a bit. All these things, like when there's a lot of people coming together, so all these temporal effects you can actually measure. Because they collect quite a bit of data and they do it like, there's a lot of people participating in this project, so it's quite high resolution data about how people move through a city, how they feel about moving through a city, how density of